FLM, wide open thinking, world-class work, and far-reaching results. Now with locations in Minneapolis, Columbus, Indianapolis, and Washington, D.C. All dedicated to serving clients who specialize in the business of agriculture and the life of rural communities.
We're really happy to have the chance to talk to Mary Kay Thatcher with the American Farm Bureau Federation. Mary Kay, thanks for joining us on Agri-Pulse.
You bet.
You just released a very major change in American Farm Bureau Farm Bill policy. Tell us how your board decided to move from where they were last year, which basically was a position calling for protection only for very deep losses and opposition to target prices, to one that embraces shallow losses and target prices.
Well, Sarah, I think our voting delegates, as you heard at our annual meeting, talked about they really still do support the catastrophic risk idea. And some have sort of described it to me as maybe we're one farm bill too early with that idea, because as we see the amount of money available to write a farm bill ratchet down, we think that proposal will become even more viable. But we were not able to get the right kind of interest in that idea on Capitol Hill last year, and I think our board really wanted to be players. They wanted to be at the table. They wanted to provide Congress something to think about this year. So during the voting delegate session, they said, we still support a catastrophic risk program, but if we can't have that, we'd like other programs where farmers are offered some kind of options. So we put together a bill that we think has some real merit to it. I think we struggled long and hard trying to find a way to make sure that we were saving the requisite amount of money and trying to make sure that we were doing that and providing a bill that would be somewhat equitable for all commodities. Because as a general farm organization, we don't have the leisure of saying, well, you know, this is the policy position we really want and it works for this commodity, maybe it won't work for these three, etc. So we tried to come up with something that had the potential to work for all commodities, would be a three-legged safety net stool where farmers would have crop insurance and marketing loans available to them, and then they would choose for the third leg of the stool, do they want a stacks type program where you're insuring county revenue losses at the 75 to 90% level, or do they want a typical target price program?
So let's explore that just a little bit more. I've seen it described in some of your documents both ways. Would you have to purchase crop insurance as a starting point for this program and then have the marketing loan available and then go on to select either stacks or target price, or how does this line up for a producer?
You would not have to participate to buy crop insurance. You would have to buy a crop insurance policy if you wanted to put stacks on top of it. We believe it was important not only from a budgetary standpoint, but for farmers to purchase some kind of individual coverage. Now, it could be catastrophic coverage, 50-55% coverage. It could be 65% buy-up. It doesn't have to be a really high level, but we suggested that farmers purchase some kind of individual coverage before they could go into stacks. We actually think there will probably be, on average, about 10% of the producers, no matter which commodity you're talking about in this country, that won't participate in stacks or target prices. So it's not necessary that you purchase crop insurance, but it is if you want to take the stacks option.
Okay, and then one of the principles that you laid out is that you want to provide a commodity title that works to encourage farmers to follow market signals rather than making planning decisions in anticipation of government payments. So what kinds of restrictions are in this proposal? For example, would you restrict plantings to program-based? Can you overplant? What things are in there to prevent that from happening?
Well, I don't think you can prevent it, but we worked really hard to come up with target prices that were based on market prices. So we looked, for example, at what the prices had been for the last 5 years and what the Congressional Budget Office thought they would be for the next 5 years. So we took a 10-year period, came up with the average, and then for wheat and producers, you would take 85% of that 10-year average price, and that would be your target price. For rice and peanuts, where crop insurance doesn't work as well, we let them take 90% of that 10-year average price. And for corn and beans, we said 75%. So there's nothing to say that if you pay on 85% of planted acres up to base, that you couldn't indeed plant more than your base, and you would still get 85% of the planted acres. But we hope we've set those levels at a market-based level.
And how did the board come up with these percentages? For example, having that difference between corn and soybeans and a 25% reduction, and wheat at 15%, rice and peanuts with a much smaller reduction. I recognize what you're saying about not having crop insurance perhaps is workable for rice and peanuts, but still there are a lot of other differences and variables that one could consider. So how do they come up with this sort of range?
Well, there's a lot of different ways you could do it. And I would say, you know, we obviously, in the whole proposal, every time we thought about doing something, you had to look at the budget, because we believed it was important to shoot for that $23 billion budget deficit reduction target that the Senate budget resolution includes. And then also to take into account that when you look at last year's Senate passed farm bill with this year's bill, it, quote, saves $10 billion less. So we thought those were important things, and that we didn't want to send a proposal to the Hill that financially wasn't doable. So everything was keeping an eye on the budget. But again, you know, we don't have a whole lot of corn and bean producers in our organization that feel like they want to take target prices. But we also think that you can absolutely prove that the crop insurance program works better for them than it works for peanuts and rice. Now, peanuts and rice, a little bit of our thought was under the stacks program, you take a 10% hit, i.e. you can't really start your stacks coverage until you get to 90% of that level. And so to therefore go over and take that same 10% hit on a target price would be a good place to start. I think with wheat, we struggled a little more. We all know that there are numerous wheat producers out there who would very much like a stacks type program, but because so much wheat is produced in the larger western counties in this country, they have a whole lot more variability when you're looking at county average revenue than does, say, someone in the Midwest. And so we tried to give them maybe an even better option to say, gosh, if you're from one of those big counties, maybe target prices are better for you than is stacks. So that's sort of how we came up with that 15%. I wouldn't say there was anything particularly methodical about it. It was more recognizing that wheat probably has a more difficult problem with that county revenue type program than do most other commodities.
And your board felt that the target price proposal would be a better option for those wheat growers than the revenue proposals, the ARC proposal that was already in the Senate plan?
Well, I think that what's happening in this town is largely a view of this farm bill, no matter what it comes out with in the end, is going to move away from more typical commodity programs, be it ARC or acre or direct payments, and more towards crop insurance, where farmers have some skin in the game. And certainly we can hear lots of detractors talking about too many subsidies in the crop insurance program. But I think with all of our urban folks, we believe there's probably more traction in a program like stacks, where you would still pay some of the premium as a producer, than simply going with a program like last year's ARC program or RLC. Now, we would certainly be much more supportive of whether it's stacks or supplemental coverage option or ARC. I think one of our biggest concerns with those shallow loss programs last year was when they were offered at the farm level. We just had a real concern that when you're offering something at 89, 90%, you could easily induce some fraud at the farm level. When you're only offering it at the county level, I think much of that concern goes away.
You also mentioned in your proposal an improved, quote-unquote, crop insurance program. How is it improved?
Well, we hope that some of the provisions that were included in both the Senate passed bill and the House Ag Committee bill last year will indeed be continued. And I would say that we liked many of those provisions, but a couple of them that we thought were really important were the enterprise unit subsidization. You know, the higher subsidy levels to go to enterprise unit was really just a pilot program at USDA. So we have to come in and pass some legislation that makes that subsidy permanent, or it will go away soon. One of the other things that was included in the bill was to say if you do enterprise units, you can separate irrigated from non-irrigated land. And that probably comes up in more farmer meetings that I go to than anything else. So we think if you take 3 or 4 of those, quote, smaller changes that are made in the crop insurance title of the Farm Bill and are able to continue them, indeed you are going to have an improved crop insurance program.
Okay. Let's talk about specialty crops for a moment. Most specialty crop producers don't say they want to be covered by a traditional farm program, yet your proposal calls for covering apples, potatoes, tomatoes, grapes, and sweet corn under stacks. Why now do those program specialty crop producers want to be covered?
Well, again, I don't think you look at stacks. Stacks would be administered via the risk management agency. It would be a crop insurance type program. You would pay a premium for it. So I don't think you have most fruit and vegetable producers saying they don't want a crop insurance program. In fact, most of them want a better program and think the program crop guys have it better. Now, that's not to say everybody, and certainly there are crops, and so we stayed away from those crops that have really said to us, we don't want a crop insurance program. We looked at crops that are widely grown across the United States, have a pretty high value as far as value of production of all crops, and already have enough data because they have crop insurance programs in place that I think putting together this GRIP type program wouldn't be all that difficult. We don't think it will be all that expensive, but we would very much sort of like to learn to walk before we run, and if we can get it for these 5 commodities, we've stated our support for trying to expand it to other people who are interested too. But so I think you look at this different. This isn't a typical program type idea that indeed most fruit and vegetable people have said we don't want. It's an improvement on their crop insurance purchasing abilities.
And do you have endorsements for this from any of the produce groups?
We haven't really asked. We didn't really go to any of the commodity groups or the produce groups and say, here's what we're doing, what do you think? We came out with the proposal. Certainly we have heard long and hard. We did talk last year when we had this catastrophic crop program. We put those same 5 commodities in it then, and we got some really positive feedback from our producers who grow those 5 commodities that they were interested in that type of idea.
And as part of your proposal to make stacks workable from a funding standpoint, you made some reductions in subsidy levels. Are you concerned that by signaling you should reduce crop insurance subsidies under stacks from 80 to 70% and make some other adjustments, that maybe you're sending a signal that we should have subsidy reductions in all types of crop insurance policies?
No, I don't think so. You know, really, we would have loved to have stacks, as it passed the Senate last year, implemented for every program crop producer. And in fact, that's where we started from. And then when we got to putting the numbers with it, what we found was that if you did that for all program crops, it was an $82 billion expense over the next 10 years. By our numbers, we think you probably only have somewhere in the range of about $32, $33 billion to play with this year. So we said, okay, how do we make this work? So we started sort of one at a time removing some of the options, i.e. you can't pay an 80% subsidy rate, how about 70? Well, that got you $6 or $7 billion. Then we looked at the harvest revenue option, and that got you another $6 or $7. Then we looked at, you know, could you do it as a standalone product, or do you require crop insurance purchases? So we said, let's require it. So, you know, if we made 4 or 5 changes to the stacks program that started last year, that again, I think we'd have had, our board would have just been excited to death if we could have offered stacks as it passed the committee last year for cotton only for every commodity, but at $82 billion we couldn't. So we finally made enough changes that we got that down to about $26, $27 billion, and that left us the money to be able to provide target prices for, primarily we suspect, peanut and rice producers will take target prices, and maybe 25–30% of wheat producers will take it. So it gave us again the chance to offer options on what works best. We would very much like to have had everything in the Senate proposal last year.
And as you talked about saving money, there has been a reference that you would be able to save $5 billion for the commodity title. Is that a number that you're being signaled from the committees that will be the target for savings in commodities?
No, I don't think so, but what you're referring to is that the CBO did a rescoring of the Senate bill and the House bill, but that passed last year, and instead of saving $23 billion, it only saved $13. So we didn't think it was fair to look at the whole $10 billion and say it's all going to come out of commodities. I don't think that's reasonable. So we just said, okay, we're going to throw out there and say half of it comes out of commodities. The rest is conservation nutrition. We haven't been told that that's exactly the right number. But, you know, I called and said, would it be reasonable to expect all $10 billion? And they said, no, absolutely not. So I suspect that whether you're talking the Senate or the House, that you're going to see cuts that are fairly similar to last year. You're going to see way more cuts in the commodity title than you see in the nutrition title, and more in commodity title than you see in the conservation title. Will they be exactly the same? No, but it's hard for me to believe that we have a huge turnaround in the way that's done and really expect to get a bill through the Senate or the House.
You mentioned mentioned that you hadn't floated this with a lot of other organizations prior to the board action, but the National Cotton Council didn't waste any time sending out a notice to their states asking them to talk to your states, saying that they are in opposition to your proposal and noting that in part your position, quote, significantly undermines, end quote, the U.S.-Brazil WTO negotiations. What's your response to that?
I think it's crazy. You know, the only thing we said in our proposal that we did not want to do because we were concerned about the WTO cotton case was the target price, reference price idea. And that's something we were very public about last year. It has always been at the top of the Brazilians' list of we just cannot have this as we move into the case. And so we were very clear. As you know, the Farm Bureau has been a very strong supporter of trade, of not giving away our subsidies until we can get them down in other countries. But again, if we have to be compliant, let's be compliant with WTO. So we said we think the target price idea, the reference price idea is likely to be non-compliant. Now, I know the Brazilians are also concerned in the Stacks proposal about the harvest revenue option and about the multiplier effect. But the fact is, we didn't remove those from the proposal because we were worried about the WTO case. We removed it because we didn't have enough money to provide it for all commodities. Again, if you give me $82 billion, I can bet you that I could go back to my board this afternoon and say, can we have a souped up Stacks program like passed the Senate last year for everybody? And they would be ecstatic about the idea. So we did not go in trying to weaken anyone's position in the Brazil case, other than we were very upfront about target prices or reference prices. And, you know, I think it's interesting. I've been in some fairly high-level offices talking about this proposal, not only yesterday after it came out, but before it came out. And I've had 3 or 4 of them say, heck, the National Cotton Council has been here in our office saying, don't give us reference prices. It won't meet the Brazilians' mark. So I think we're actually saying the same thing, and I don't think we're saying anything we haven't been saying for a good year.
Okay, so tell us how this is going to play out over the next couple of weeks. Are you still expecting the Senate Ag Committee to start marking up the week of the 22nd?
I think, you know, I'll be really surprised if we don't have markup the week of the 22nd or the 29th or maybe the first week in May. I think that there is every attempt in the Senate to make sure that Senator Cochran was sort of behind the 8 ball in being able to really hire staff and get them started, because with sequestration, they didn't know what kind of money they had to hire staff. They wanted to get the right kind of people. So I think that there's a real attempt to let them hit the ground and make sure they're on board and ready to go, and it's a bipartisan kind of markup. So I think whether you're talking Republicans or Democrats, House or Senate Ag Committee, everybody would like to go in a couple of weeks and get this thing moving. They think it's the right idea. But I think you're having sort of internal politics about, are there certain segments that are quite ready to go yet, through no fault of their own, but just through the fact that, you know, we did change Congress, we do have some new members of committees, et cetera.
And what about on the House side?
Well, the House side has also indicated to me the sooner the better, and that they would very much like to move this along as soon as possible. Now, I don't think in either case, Sarah, that just because you pass it through the Senate Ag Committee or the House Committee, you can get it through the Senate or the House floor, you know, the next day. So this still could be a very long, drawn-out process. And I think it's still entirely possible we're not looking at having a farm bill till September or October. But to me, the sooner we get this process moving, the better.
Right. Thanks very much, Mary Kay. I appreciate you joining us on Agri-Pulse.
You bet.